Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I'm excited to dive into this one because this is a topic that I like to talk about. It's our very own local president that comes right from my area. Much of my family, 3 of my 4 grandparents grew up in Niles, Ohio, which is the birthplace of William McKinley, our 25th president. I live in Poland, Ohio, which is where he grew up. In fact, right out my window, you can see the sign that marks the spot where his house was that he grew up in. So pretty excited to dive into this topic. This is on Extra History. It looks like they have a series of videos on this topic. A couple of weeks ago, episode 1 came out, so we'll go ahead and take a look at it now that episode 2 is out. I don't want to step on their videos and give them time to be watched. And so if you want to see part 2, and I encourage you to check out part 2, it is now available on Extra History's site. So check out part 2 of this series right now after you watch part 1 and watch my reaction to part 1. And I will do my reaction to part 2 in several more days once their part 2 has had time to get its views and everything. That's typically how I try to do things. We want to encourage our content creators, our original content creators, whenever possible. And I want to thank Ty. Ty didn't give an address or a last name or anything, just Ty. Ty, thank you for signing up just a couple of months ago as a new patron. I really appreciate your support. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Buffalo, New York, September 5th,
we're going to start there.
In what seems like a miracle, electric lights illuminate the soaring buildings of the Pan American Exposition. This is a World's Fair, one celebrating the continent that appears poised to make the 20th century the American century, and speaking is the man who made that happen.
Why does it say MW? Shouldn't it be WM?
President William McKinley squints into the lights, giving the best speech of his life, one that, ironically, repudiates the protectionism and tariff policies that catapulted him to political office in the first place.
The period of exclusiveness is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is the pressing problem.
So this is interesting because even though I know this is the narrator of the entire video doing this and they've got some effects on his voice, it sounds to me like he has obviously listened to a recording of William McKinley's speeches, which there are some that exist, because he's definitely using a very similar tonal quality and manner of speaking. He sounds like William McKinley giving this speech.
Commercial wars are unprofitable. A policy of goodwill and friendly trade relations will prevent reprisals. Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of the times. Measures of retaliation are not.
He is arguing to end insularity and promote American free trade to the world.
And that is interesting because it does go against many of the things he stood for when he was in Congress. But this is one of the reasons why I laugh when I hear presidential candidates make promises about what they're going to do, because inevitably either the circumstances change or when they become president, they find out things they didn't necessarily know before. And that changes. And for William McKinley, the nature of the world had changed dramatically from the 1870s to the 1890s, from the time when he's first going to Congress to when he becomes president. And to his credit, he changed with those times.
And that is fitting since his presidency has made the United States a global power. Yet out in the darkness is another man with a revolver in his pocket. A man who in less than 24 hours will kill an American president.
I'm splitting hairs, but he'll mortally wound an American president. McKinley lived for like a week after he was shot. So are we getting, I always wonder when I see the books like that, if that represents how many episodes there are, because I know there are 2 episodes so far, but I don't know how many there's going to be for this.
Part of our historical tale is brought to you by Nebula, but more on them and how you can see the second chapter of this McKinley series before anyone else after the episode. William McKinley has been called the architect of the American century. During his presidency, he led the United States through a transformation from a relatively insular nation to an outward-looking one, engaged in global trade. And
absolutely true, and I don't think he gets nearly enough credit or blame, depending on how you look at it all, for America's transformation and all of that. You know, we think a lot about people like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson for dragging America into the world stage, but William McKinley's really where that ball gets rolling.
Was able to project power across the globe. He won a massively successful war, added to the country's first colonial possessions, and wrestled with running a modern economy. However, today, he's mostly known for having been assassinated, paving the way for his much flashier successor, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, McKinley is often called a forgotten president, but that's not really true. For instance, while he may not be well remembered nationally, he's revered in his burial place of Canton, Ohio.
So yeah, that's what his tomb looks like today, and it's got a great museum right next to it. It's real close to the NFL Hall of Fame, so if you make a trip to Canton, go to the NFL Hall of Fame, and literally right down the street is William McKinley's tomb. You can see one from the other. And it's definitely worth your time. We have schools all over the place. Canton has a Canton McKinley. There's a Sebring McKinley not far from there. Niles McKinley in his birthplace. A lot of schools named after him. He's definitely very, very popular here in Northeast Ohio,
where he's looked on as almost a slain martyr. He's also remembered outside the continental U.S., though much less fondly. In the Philippines, he's seen as supporting the struggle for independence before betraying it in favor of colonial domination. In China, there are museums dedicated to the looting carried out by U.S. Marines who, sent by McKinley, sacked the Imperial Summer Palace during the Boxer Rebellion. And in Rob's hometown of Honolulu, McKinley's role in annexing Hawaii is still controversial enough that there have been multiple attempts to rename a high school christened in his honor and remove a statue of him from the grounds.
And this is true with a lot of historical figures, right? I mean, I hate Woodrow Wilson. I go to Europe and I'm using the services of a train that is leaving from a Woodrow Wilson train station, big statue of him out front, and monuments to him all over the place, and streets named after him. It depends entirely on what part of the world you're in and how your part of the world was impacted by that historical figure, how they're viewed even today.
Which is all really interesting in its contrast, because by all accounts, it was hard to dislike McKinley
Super nice guy.
Personally. He was amiable, friendly, rarely had a cross-word for anyone, and was an unusually devoted husband for the time.
Yeah, probably one of the most religious presidents we've ever had. Really nice guy. And, of course, some people will look at his presidency and argue, well, how can you say he's a nice guy? Look at what happened in the Philippines and other places during his presidency. And those are fair questions to ask. But somebody can be personally a very kind person and make decisions as president that impacted people in a very terrible way at the same time. George W. Bush is a great example of this. Obviously, some people will point at his presidency and say, look at Hurricane Katrina, look at Iraq, look at the millions who suffered. But by all accounts, Democrats, Republicans, everybody in between personally liked the guy, found him to be a very likable guy. And that's true with William McKinley, especially as a husband. Super supportive of his wife Ida, who dealt with some pretty significant mental and physical health crises later in life, and he was right there through all of it.
In short, he was a nice guy whose policy decisions resulted in terrible things, often halfway around the globe. But that kind of international reach was unimaginable when McKinley was born in January of 1843. The seventh child out of 9, raised in a strict Methodist household.
Yep.
He received a good education and had some college by the time the Civil War broke out in 1861.
And it's kind of cool for me personally because I was actually the youth pastor at the Methodist Church in Niles, Ohio, which is where his family went to church. In fact, right down the street from the church, a couple of members of McKinley's family are buried there. I think one of his sisters is buried there. He's born in Niles, Ohio, grows up here in Poland, Ohio, goes to school in Meadville, Pennsylvania, but then the Civil War breaks out and changes everything, like it did for a lot of people.
And McKinley, raised in an abolitionist household, put his mother's protestations aside and joined up as a private at the age of 18. And he'd end the war having gained 4 significant things.
So he joins Company E of the 23rd Ohio Infantry. They're known as the Poland Rifles, that company. In fact, cemetery right down the street, big row of guys all from Company E. The 23rd Ohio is the very first 3 years regiment for the state of Ohio. Yes, there are regiments with numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 22 that end up having 3-year versions. But the 23rd Ohio was the first regiment that began its existence as a 3-year regiment. Their initial colonel is William Stark Rosecrans, who's going to end up being an Army commander. Their lieutenant colonel is Rutherford B. Hayes, who will go on to be president. You have multiple other really prominent people in that regiment. I actually did a video on the 23rd Ohio from the Antietam battlefield that you can check out and hear more about some of the other people in the regiment.
Brevet promotion to major, a friendship with the future president Rutherford B. Hayes, a deep appreciation for the horrors of war, and a reputation for unbelievable bravery.
Yeah.
McKinley largely served as a commissary officer, delivering...
That was true early in the war. He was a commissary sergeant, so he's responsible for food and supplies. He gets nicknamed Coffee Bill, and his political opponents tried to use that against him, but it actually backfired. At the Battle of Antietam, he is remembered for bringing hot food and hot coffee to guys under fire, whereas most guys didn't get anything to eat during the day. But immediately after the Battle of Antietam, he gets a battlefield commission. He becomes an officer, and he's a line officer. He's serving on the front lines commanding troops. He wasn't always a supply guy.
Food, ammunition, and messages to the front line, often under heavy fire. He participated in 11 battles, including Antietam, which at nearly 23,000 casualties still ranks as the bloodiest day of combat in U.S. history.
And if you go to the Antietam battlefield, go to the southern end of the battlefield where Burnside Bridge is. If you cross over to the Confederate side, the western side of the bridge, and go up the hill where the Confederates were, huge monument, one of the biggest monuments on the battlefield to William McKinley. Who was just a commissary sergeant at the battle, but after he was assassinated, his colleagues wanted to dedicate that a monument to him in honor of his service at the Battle of Antietam.
And in those engagements, he became famous for taking assignments that were considered suicide missions. More than once, Hayes dispatched him with a wagon of supplies, not believing he'd return, and he once had his horse shot out from under him. McKinley was justly proud of his service, and even once president, preferred to be called the Major.
That was actually a pretty common thing. People in political offices liked to be referred to by their military rank. People often called Grant General Grant, even when he was president. When Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, he was called Colonel Hamilton, and later General Hamilton when he became a Major General. People tended, even after they left office as president, they wouldn't refer to him as President so-and-so. They'd refer to him as General Eisenhower, not President Eisenhower.
After the war, he returned to Ohio and began building a life for himself, studying law and opening a lucrative legal practice in the growing manufacturing hub of Canton. And from there, it didn't take him long to step into local politics. Yep. In 1867, his old commander Rutherford B. Hayes ran for governor on the Republican ticket, and McKinley stumped for him, helping Hayes win a highly polarized district. McKinley's talent for politics was clear enough that he ran for prosecutor in the same district 2 years later, managing a surprise win for an office that had been long held by Democrats. Granted, he was ousted 2 years later, but it showed promise.
Yeah, and it also gets people's attention. When you win in places you're not expected to win, people take notice. Why did he win? What does he have going for him? What can we learn from that? And can he do this on a larger scale?
Now, as McKinley and his legal partner were cleaning up financially, he decided he wanted to embark on a new partnership. This time, a personal one. Walking to his Methodist church to teach Sunday school, McKinley kept passing a woman walking the other way to teach Sunday school at the Presbyterian church, Ida Saxton. She was a member of a prominent family who, at the time, were unusual in their support of equal education for women. Ida had attended boarding school and a finishing school, then controversially had taken a job as a clerk at her father's bank before touring Europe.
A lot of people don't remember Ida Saxton mainly because she was in such poor health by the time she became First Lady, that she wasn't a very active First Lady. But this is a woman that reminds me a lot of like Abigail Adams. Good education, good head on her shoulders, beautiful woman. Very well thought of by the people who knew her, just dealt with a lot of personal tragedy in her life that affected her by the time she got to the place where she could use that influence on a large scale.
One day, he passed her a note suggesting that they walk together, and after a year of courtship, they married in January of 1871. embarking on what promised to be an idyllic family life.
Yeah, and if you can't tell already, obviously I'm biased because of being from Northeast Ohio and this being our local president and first lady. But just on a personal, whatever you think of the politics of the day and the decisions he made as president or in Congress, just personally, I like these two a lot. I really do.
They had a daughter, Katie, quickly got pregnant again, but then everything started going wrong. Ida's mother passed away, and at the funeral, Ida fell from a carriage and sustained a head injury. Then their second daughter died a few months after birth, and Ida entered a deep depression, which only deepened when less than 2 years later, their remaining daughter, Katie, died at age 4. Ida then began suffering epileptic seizures, possibly due to the head injury, and William stepped in as her caregiver, staying physically close to her as much as possible for the rest of their lives.
Here's a guy who spends a couple of decades in Congress, gets elected governor of Ohio, twice elected president of the United States, and still managed to be a devoted husband to a very frail wife.
However, she insisted that he not give up his political ambitions. And McKinley's political star was rising. After defending 21 striking miners charged with rioting and getting all but one off.
And this is interesting because McKinley is very often seen as the big business guy, right? So you would think on the surface, well, if I'm thinking of William McKinley, he's probably going to take the side of the mine company, not the miners. But that's not what he did. And here comes Mark Hanna.
McKinley suddenly found himself both with working-class political support and a new ally in Mark Hanna, a Republican Party kingmaker.
So if you think of parallels, like I mentioned earlier, between William McKinley and George W. Bush, George W. Bush had Karl Rove, who was his kind of the brains behind the operation, right? And that's who Mark Hanna is. Mark Hanna is a local guy, too, born in Lisbon, Ohio, which is right down the road. And ends up becoming a U.S. Senator in the 1890s. He's buried up in Cleveland in the same cemetery that James Garfield's buried in. But Mark Hanna is very much the kingmaker, so to speak.
Ironically, Hanna had been one of the mine owners in the dispute, but put that aside when he saw the young lawyer's potential. McKinley ran for the House of Representatives in the 1876 election, while supporting his mentor Hayes for president that same year. The presidential election ended up too close to call, and Hayes only took office once the Republicans struck the Compromise of 1876, agreeing to end Reconstruction in the South in exchange for taking the presidency. And oh boy, does that deserve an episode one day. Zoe, mark it down, you know the drill. Who knew there was this much history? McKinley, though, he won his election handily. And his greatest policy? Protectionism. In McKinley's mind, America's rapidly expanding manufacturing and agricultural sectors needed to be shielded from having their prices undercut by the more established manufacturers in Europe.
Now, this makes a lot of sense when you think about everything's about context, right? It's one thing for us to look back on policies and say, that's stupid, it doesn't make any sense. But in context, it does. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, you have a couple of things going on. You have a rapid expansion of manufacturing. You have a rapid amount of immigration happening, especially from places like the UK. But you also then have in 1873, you have a financial crisis, and a lot of these manufacturing facilities end up shutting down, and tens of thousands of workers are out of jobs. And so in that vacuum then comes William McKinley, elected to Congress, thinking about how do we make sure that this panic of 1873 doesn't happen again? How do we deal with the rapidly changing economy of our nation?
Now, the United States had already levied tariffs on imports, which is how it raised revenue before the national income tax, and had paid off its debts from the Civil War.
Yeah, so the Civil War, there was a national income tax that was levied on a very small percentage of earners, but it was temporary. And it went away once the war was over, and it went back to being tariffs as the number one source of revenue for the federal government. It's only going to be when Woodrow Wilson's president that you're going to have a constitutional amendment passed that's going to allow for a permanent income tax.
In fact, the U.S. was in such good financial position due to collecting tariffs and controlling spending that by the time McKinley was in Congress, it was running on a budget surplus. Though, keep in mind, the US also provided little to no social services and had a relatively small military.
Right.
Over the next 14 years, he'd serve Ohio in the House of Representatives, becoming the Republicans' main advocate for tariffs, while trying to remain moderate on other domestic issues like currency. He was popular, and at one point, when Democrats redistricted his seat, causing him to lose re-election, he managed to get elected again in the next cycle. And through it all, he made protectionism his hallmark. "I am a tariff man," he'd say, "standing on a tariff platform." By 1889, he was one of the most prominent Republican members of Congress, an incredibly distinguished and stately man who was often said to look like Napoleon. A resemblance, it should be said, that political cartoonists of the day put to wicked use. But it was in that year that McKinley was made chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, where he could help steer his pet project.
You're one of the most powerful people in the country when you are chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, especially at this time in history. There's so much influence and so much power because of the things that are controlled and the things that are paid for directly through the work of the Ways and Means Committee. This is exactly where he wanted to be.
A bill called the McKinley Tariff. The final legislation was not exactly what McKinley had envisioned. It had hundreds of amendments. In fact, it actually removed tariffs on a number of goods the US did not produce, like sugar, molasses, tea, and coffee. No sense in tariffing things you can't produce domestically, right? Right? Because that would make no sense, right? You might as well start asking.
Listen, I get it. Everybody's entitled to say what they want, but if you're doing a history channel, I just wish you'd avoid inserting these moments of ranting about current politics. All you're going to do is get half of your audience really excited and get the other half really upset. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Asking ChatGPT to tariff some penguins and destroy my retirement account. Anyway, it also raised tariffs on things like wool and tin plate, industries that were still developing in the US. Tin plate, in particular, was targeted. These were plates of thin steel lined with
Why?
tin.
Why do you have to throw the was it Walpole thing up there? What do you got to do that to me for? Extra history, huh? Really? For those of you who are new to the channel, at some point I will once again explain why I get upset about that. It's an inside joke.
To prevent rusting, used in cheap pots and pans, roof tiles, and the manufacture of tin cans and boxes. Most of the tin plate bought in the US was manufactured in the UK, at least until the McKinley Tariff nearly destroyed the UK tin plate industry overnight, when the tariff went from 30% to 70%. Ironically, many Cornish and Welsh tin plate workers who lost their jobs due to the McKinley Tariff ended up immigrating to the United States.
So this is the thing about, you can say this about any government policy. When you're dealing with tariffs, there's a positive aspect to it for your country, but there's also the potential for negative. And you can't always measure which way it's going to go. Even initially, it could go one way, but it might take years to really see the effects of it. And you might help an industry, you might hurt somebody else's industry, you might hurt something within the United States, you might hurt the consumers, but help the industry. There's always a trade-off to be made.
Similar rates were raised on imported wool from the UK. So, did the McKinley tariffs work? Well, kinda.
Maybe.
It sped up the domestic manufacture of tin plate a bit, but at the cost of massive and immediate price increases for Americans across a whole range of goods. And y'all, people hated it. In fact, they hated it so much that in the 1890 election, it was a bloodbath for Republicans in the House of Representatives, where they went from 171 seats to 88. McKinley himself lost, albeit narrowly and partially due to gerrymandering. Yet he still remained popular in Ohio and was easily elected governor in the next cycle, but that was just a springboard.
Yeah, and listen, McKinley had the three things necessary to get elected president in the decades after the American Civil War. He was from Ohio, he was a Civil War veteran, and he was a Republican. And that almost always was what happened in order to become president, right? Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley. They're all Republicans from Ohio, Civil War veterans.
Republican President Benjamin Harrison was unpopular, and though McKinley supported him in the 1892 election, it was common knowledge that McKinley was building alliances to make his own run in 1896. And as it happened, Harrison lost, which might have been lucky for the Republicans, because that meant the Democrats took the heat for the Panic of 1893.
So whatever you think of McKinley's policies on tariffs and all the stuff that was going on, how much did he create the circumstances for his own election? Who knows? Did the tariffs contribute to the what was called the Great Depression after 1893? It certainly could have been one of the things. There were, like anything, there were a number of factors. But Grover Cleveland's second term in office wasn't nearly as popular as his first. And you have to wonder, if Harrison won in 1892, does McKinley get elected in 1896? Maybe, maybe not.
A financial crisis that would be the worst in American history until the Great Depression. There were a lot of causes, of course. A collapse in grain prices, a railway bubble, a bill that caused the Treasury to buy large amounts of silver, and a run on gold due to a bank failure in Argentina. But one factor were the McKinley Tariffs. And who would reap the benefit of the Democrats being blamed? William McKinley, who entered the race for the presidency in the 1896 election. But he would have to work for it, because his Democratic opponent was William Jennings Bryan, a young popular orator who went on a whistle-stop tour of the country, sometimes delivering as many as 34 speeches in a day.
So William Jennings Bryan, also a very religious guy, pretty conservative. He's going to end up being the Democratic nominee, I think, 3 times for president. And he's going to play to his strengths. What are his strengths? He's a great speaker. He is somebody who's very influential when he's in front of a crowd. This is a time when people didn't necessarily do that. McKinley's in his 50s. He is not going to go door-to-door campaigning. It's a time when most people didn't do that. So he's going to do his front porch campaign, which is also going to be wildly successful.
He rallied against the Republicans and their big business cronies and advocated for, quote, free silver. An idea that mining interests should increase the money supply by directly striking silver coins without government control.
So what is going on? What are the main issues of the day? Silver versus the gold standard. Big issue of the day. One of the most prominent. You have the very famous Cross of Gold speech that's given during this time talking about that. You have expansionism versus protectionism. You have European powers becoming imperialist, and does the United States get involved? You have the U.S. starting to build up its navy so that it can project its power. You have tariffs continuing to be a major issue. You have things like things that are going to become much bigger issues in a decade or two to come, like women's suffrage and temperance. The temperance movement is a very popular thing at this time.
This would cause inflation, but he argued that would benefit American producers by increasing the money supply. McKinley, on the other hand, was a gold bug. While he was interested in mixing some silver into the reserve, he wanted to keep America on the gold standard to keep things stable and avoid inflation. Early on, Bryan looked like he'd sweep Election Day. McKinley, now 53, couldn't keep up with Bryan's energy and was nowhere near as good a speaker.
Play to your strengths. What's William McKinley's strength? He's a personable guy. He is likable. He's the kind of guy you want to have a beer with, even though he didn't probably drink beer himself. So William McKinley getting up in front of a big crowd is not his strength. What is his strength? Individual interactions with people. So play to that.
So why try to play the same game? Instead, he launched the first front porch campaign, making it known that he would receive visitors at his home in Canton for 6 days a week. People would come to him, making use of America's now vast rail network. And come they did. Delegations of men visiting from counties across the United States. Interested groups, even all-women delegations came, promising to lobby their husbands to vote McKinley.
You meet the guy personally, you feel like I like him. I want him to be successful. I want him to be president. And it encourages you to go back and tell other people what you experienced. It's not, I heard a speech. It's, I like this guy. He's going to do a great job. And it doesn't hurt that he's got big business on his side, paying for people to travel for free to go see McKinley.
It all happened in a genial party atmosphere, and by the end of the campaign, over 750,000 people had made the pilgrimage.
Think about how absurd that number is at a time when the country didn't have nearly as many people as it does today. For that many people to have that kind of interaction with a presidential candidate.
McKinley also engaged big business, which feared Bryan and his populist policies. Railroads backed McKinley by offering discounted tickets to his Canton home. Factories told workers and suppliers they would have to shut down or cancel orders if Bryan was elected. And some employers even threatened layoffs and put campaign literature into pay envelopes. Oh, and the
This is really the first time you see money having a heavy influence on an election. Did it determine the outcome? Maybe, maybe not, but it certainly was a big factor in the election itself. And that's just another reason why we're seeing the dawn of the 20th century in terms of how America operates.
Coons also gave money, donating $3.5 million to McKinley's campaign, 7 times what Bryan had received, and possibly more than the total of all previous campaign contributions in American history. I'm sure that won't snowball into something destructive in years to come. That money went into a blizzard of campaign materials, from posters to little gold bug buttons. Oh yeah, that's right. Yep. McKinley's 1896 campaign invented the campaign button as well as the direct mailer, because
when you have that kind of money, when you have 7 times the money that your opponent does, you can spend it on stuff that your opponent can't do. Direct mailings and pins and posters and all this kind of stuff that gets your name out there all over the place.
You might have to go to McKinley's porch to see him, but he was also in your mailbox as well. This has actually been called America's first modern political campaign. Yeah. And come election night, McKinley crushed Bryan in the Electoral College, though the popular vote was uncomfortably close. McKinley's economic argument had propelled him to the White House. Yet, ironically, his presidency would be dominated not by questions of protectionism, but of imperialism.
And this is what happens, right? And I laugh sometimes when I hear about presidential candidates talk about what they're going to do as president, because they have no idea what's going to happen when they're president and how the circumstances will change from what they ran on.
For as we'll see next week, trouble was brewing in the Caribbean, and McKinley, who was skeptical of wars and expressed little interest in overseas territories, was about to plunge headlong into the Spanish-American War.
All right, that was fantastic. As always, I love Extra History. They do a great job with everything. I definitely encourage you to go check out episode 2 of this McKinley series. That way you've watched it already by the time my reaction comes out, which I will do sometime in the next few days once their video's been out for a little while. I want to thank Cullen Hill and Aiden Wigginton. I don't have locations for either of you, but thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.